All right, welcome everybody to the 35th Teachers Teaching with Technology International Conference. My name is Vince O'Connell, and I'm part of the educator support team at Texas Instruments, and I'm pleased to be able to welcome you today from across the world. Good evening for those that are joining us from where it is evening, and good morning or good afternoon from wherever else you are joining us. Again, really excited to be here. Take a couple minutes, familiarize yourself with the platform that we have. This is WebEx. We've just have the opportunity to chat, which is going to be a big part of all of the sessions today. We'll use it this morning. So take a few minutes and familiarize yourself with that. And again, we're continuing to see people join us. So just start with a couple of things. Again, we've talked about the chat. It will be an integral part of everything that we do today. Once we finish, you'll receive a survey via the miracle of email. We'd love to have your feedback on how things went. And so just know that that's going to come in an email. And then also the resources, everything that goes on today will be live or on the event website, including a recording of all of the sessions today. And so a couple of things that I am tasked to do. One is welcome you, and I do that. The other thing is to hit the record button. So we are in great stead, and we are excited about the day. Again, chat is there throughout, and we are excited to again get things kicked off this morning. And we have a great thinker, a great individual. I've had the opportunity to work with our keynote, Paul Gray, Dr. Paul Gray. Paul's going to talk to us about powerful learning and relevant learning. And I got the chance a few years ago to spend some time doing some road shows or summits across Texas. And so I get a chance to see Paul at a variety of things. Again, he just to think about somebody that has dedicated his life to math, whether it's teachers of mathematics, math leadership. That's, again, just an exciting to be able to see somebody that's this continues to serve. And so we're excited to have him as part of our T-Cubed International Conference. And so, Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you and welcome everybody.
All right. Thank you, Vince. I'm going to attempt to gracefully share my screen. Okay, there we go. And then I've got you should be able to see me in the corner of the screen. So again, Vince, thank you for the opportunity to spend time with everybody today. And what I'm going, let me tell you a little bit about my background first of all. I started out, I was reading through the introductions in the chat boxes, people were coming in, and there's a lot of common, some connections between me and several of the people here. I grew up in Houston, Texas, and went to the University of Oklahoma to get my degree in meteorology. I decided I wanted to be a storm chaser. And that senior year, I had been working with an NSF project with middle school science teachers. And I thought, you know what? I really like teaching. So I thought if it came to college to chase tornadoes, clearly I like risk. So let's do it all and teach 8th grade. And so that's exactly what I did. I taught 8th grade earth science in Chickasha, Oklahoma. I did that for a couple of years. And then when I got tired of winter, moved back home to Houston. And that's where I taught high school math and science, and then worked my way up the curriculum food chain to director of math and science for a school district in the Houston area. Decided I like teaching and learning more than being an administrator. And so that's that brought me to what I'm doing now. I'm the Chief Curriculum Officer for Cousins and Associates, and so I lead a team that develops instructional materials for mathematics, as well as provides professional learning for school districts around Texas. And I now live in the Dallas area. As my mother tells the story, I moved up north, but you can tell just from the couple minutes that I've been talking, I am definitely a Texas boy. So I want to begin by acknowledging that if we are in North America, we reside and we work on the ancestral lands of many indigenous nations. And I mentioned that I live in Dallas now. Right currently, my husband and I have a place in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is at the very tip of Cape Cod. And so that's where I am now. So I wanted to start the presentation by acknowledging that I am currently on the ancestral lands of the Wampanoag Nation. And their ancestors have lived on what we now call Cape Cod and Southeast Massachusetts for over 10,000 years. Wampanoag translates to people of the first light. And this is where the sun rises beautifully at 5 a.m. during the summer, hence the first light. You may know the Wampanoag Nation from the stories we've been told of the first Thanksgiving. They were the indigenous people that welcomed the Mayflower Pilgrims at first, before relations turned sour. The Mayflower itself came from England and first touched shore in Provincetown Harbor before they realized there's no fresh water here. And then they found the village of Patuxet across Cape Cod Bay that had been abandoned because the indigenous population had been wiped out from disease. And so they turned that into the town site of Plymouth, and that's where you know the story of the Mayflower Pilgrims from. The Wampanoag Nation continues to flourish in Southeast Massachusetts with a robust sense of history and storytelling and cultural contributions. And as we go through our learning today, let's be mindful of how we can serve not only our indigenous population, the indigenous teachers and students that we are called to serve, but also the other marginalized groups that we work with. I also want to introduce you to NCSM. Historically, it's the National Council of Supervisors of Mathematics. We were founded in 1968. And in the 60s, math leaders called themselves supervisors. We were supervisors of mathematics. What we would now think of as coaching was called clinical supervision. That was the model for teacher professional learning that was quite popular in the 60s and 70s. And so that's where the S in NCSM came from. A few years ago, we rebranded to the initialism NCSM Leadership in Mathematics Education because we no longer think of ourselves as supervisors. We're math leaders. So our members, NCSM is the premier mathematics education leadership organization, I would say, on the planet, but I'm the president of NCSM, so I'm a little biased. Our members include math coordinators and math specialists at the district level, instructional coaches at the campus level, department chairs, grade level teacher leads, lead teachers. Teacher leadership is a real thing. Many of our members lead from the classroom. We are a professional learning network. We produce an annual conference that's chock-a-block full of sessions for math leaders. We have it adjacent to NCTM, National Council of Teachers of Mathematics Conference. I like to call that Math Week because it's 7 days of learning about mathematics when you pull the two organizations together. We focus on equity for all teachers and students to experience high quality math teaching and learning. We're 2,200 members strong. We're a source for resources so that as a math leader, you can do your job better. So our agenda for the next portion of the hour, I like to use a roadmap because I think of it as a journey. So we're going to start out, I'm going to talk about what is culturally relevant instruction. And then we're going to talk about stages of tasks, math or science tasks. Then we're going to talk about how we can take the tasks that we have and make them more culturally relevant. And we're going to wrap up with some reflections and implications. So this is kind of my to-do list for the next 50-ish minutes that we have together. But I do want to begin by, I like to make some certain assumptions clear, and I do want to acknowledge that there, in some places, words like culture and culturally relevant are trigger words that can generate a particular reaction with different people. So when I use the terms culturally relevant or culturally responsive in this presentation, I'm doing it in an academic sense because those are the names for frameworks that were created back in the 1990s that help us make sense of how to make the learning that happens in our classroom more relevant to the students that are in the room. And that's important because when you talk about teaching and learning, it's a human endeavor. There's a human being at the front of the room guiding the learning, and then there are humans actually learning the science and the mathematics. And so anytime you have human interaction, culture is an important part of it. Teaching and learning is a human endeavor, and so we have to pay attention to the culture in the room. And so in this presentation, we're going to kick around some ideas about how we might make our science and mathematics more relevant to those human beings. And so I'm going to drop a lot of links in the chat box as we go through the presentation. There's a lot of resources that I'm going to share with you. And I failed at the beginning, so I'm going to go click back a lot real here. The bit.ly link that I have on the screen, bit.ly/NCSM cultural. And it is case sensitive. I just put that in the chat box. That will take you to a Google Drive folder that has most of the resources I'm going to share with you in there. So I want to make sure you have that so that you can add those pieces to your digital archives. Okay. I also want to share some data with you. This is something that I learned about this past spring, that a group called the Global Strategy Group worked in concert with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And they're about to start a big investment in upper elementary, middle school mathematics to help boost the mathematics learning for certain student populations. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation wanted to know, what do parents in general and adults in general believe about mathematics education and mathematics instruction? And they surveyed about 2,400 adults and asked them a series of questions. And there's two questions in particular with the results that I wanted to share with y'all to kind of set the table for our discussions this morning or this evening, depending on where you are on the planet. And one of the questions that really jumped out to me is they asked parents about what they felt about how making math education relevant and engaging connects to their children's success in mathematics. And what they found is that 96% of parents either strongly agreed or somewhat agreed that when mathematics is relevant and engaging, that it does make it more likely that their children will be successful. And there's a question in the chat box. Yes, this was a representative random sample. They did not cherry pick the adults that they worked with, but they did focus on key states that they're interested in, including California, Texas, New York, and Florida. So those are overrepresented compared to the other 46 states. And they also paid particular attention to parents of color and adults of color. And so they were slightly oversampled compared to the percent of the population for the national population. So there were a couple of caveats in there. So I will disclose those data points. Another question that they asked that I found the results interesting, we found that large majorities of adults are inclined to believe that making mathematics education more personally relevant and relatable for students of different backgrounds makes it more likely that kids will succeed in math class. And 71% of adults said that if students are able to connect to and see themselves in what they're learning in math class, then they're more likely to succeed. And that's important, that's significant. 71% is a large majority. And so it's important to keep in mind, this is what adults, including some teachers and parents, believe about how relevant mathematics connects to student success. I do not have similar data for science because the math data is what was made known to me. So with these pieces in mind, I want to talk about what is culturally relevant instruction. And there's a couple of frameworks that I'm going to introduce you to. One of them is culturally relevant instruction from Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. She is a professor emerita from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and this is a framework that she created in the 1990s. And 1994 is when her book, The Dream Keepers, came out. And in essence, the notion of culturally relevant instruction is teaching where students are empowered by aspects of their own culture to engage in their own learning. Culture is not an add-on. It's not like Problem Solving Fridays where you do naked math Monday through Thursday and then Friday focus on solving problems, but culture is placed alongside the mathematics or the science instruction, and it becomes part of the curriculum. And in Dr. Ladson-Billings' framework, there's 3 tenets of culturally relevant pedagogy. And I want to talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. Yeah, a friend of mine from South Texas, she was math coordinator at McAllen 100 years ago, introduced me to what we call the nudist camp for numbers, where we spend all of our time teaching decontextualized mathematics, and we forget to put clothes on the numbers every now and again. So I took a riff from that. That's one of those things that just kind of sticks with you over time. So take that and steal it. That's at no extra charge. That's what you get for coming to the keynote session this morning. You can talk about that with your folks. So the first pillar in Dr. Ladson-Billings' framework is academic excellence. And y'all, that's the whole reason we do school. We want kids to learn the mathematics and the science that we're teaching them. If we don't do that, then everything else is just window dressing. We've got to keep at the forefront the high quality teaching and learning and the content that kids deserve to know, that kids are entitled to know. If we don't do that, what we end up with is a feel-good curriculum where students feel good about themselves and their cultures and the cultures of their peers, but then at the end of the year, they leave us without the science or the mathematics that they need to have to be successful next year. And there's a lot of chances for inequities unless we intentionally attend to academic excellence. The second tenet in Dr. Ladson-Billings' framework is cultural competence. And this is important because remember earlier I mentioned that teaching and learning is a human endeavor, and anytime that you have humans interacting, culture is at play. Culture is simply the way that we do things as we move around in the world, how we make sense of what happens around us. And when you have people from different cultures, and we have a lot of multicultural classrooms out there, then you have people that are making sense of the same experience differently because they're looking at it through a different cultural lens. So cultural competence asks students, get more familiar with your own culture, but also get more familiar with the cultures in the room around you. It's almost like the dual language instruction model. I mentioned that I grew up in, most of my teaching career has been in the Houston area. And Houston is a very rich multicultural city. For example, Houston has the largest Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam because at the end of the Vietnam War, there was a lot of resettlement from South Vietnam into Southeast Texas, because come to find out, hot, soupy, and swampy was something they were familiar with, and that's what Houston is. And so we have a lot, and Houston's also, if you look at historical geography, Southeast Texas and the Houston area is where Mexico and French Louisiana collide. So you've got the Mexican influence from South Texas. Remember, Texas used to be part of Mexico. And then the Cajun influence that comes in from Southwest Louisiana. So you get, Houston's a very rich cultural melting pot. So one of the things that several school districts do there is dual language immersion models, where it's not just teaching everybody to learn English, but the content instruction is done in multiple language. So you'll have some schools that are Spanish English dual instruction, and some schools that are Mandarin Chinese or Vietnamese English dual instruction. And that's building students' language competence, multilingual learners. Cultural competence is something similar where you're building your own cultural chops. You're learning more about your own culture, but also the cultures of other people in the room. One of the things that when we're building cultural competence as teachers, we need to ask ourselves, who do we position as capable mathematicians and scientists? And so on screen here is a collection of people. Okay, now you can see everybody. I was covering up one of them. You see some names that, these are faces that I might recognize from my own science and math books. You have people like Euclid, Pythagoras, Euler, Rene Descartes, Gauss, Mendeleev, Niels Bohr, Isaac Newton, Blaise Pascal. These are all men who made incredible contributions that moved Western European science and mathematics forward. And so these are the names that you typically would see in a science or math textbook. These are the faces that would be in the margin. For our students to see themselves as capable doers of science and mathematics, they have to see people who look like them in those positions. So they need to see people like German mathematician and our pioneer of abstract algebra, Emmy Noether. And she's been described as the most influential woman in mathematics and theoretical physics because of her contributions to the field. We should talk about people like Fields Medal winner, Iranian mathematician Mariam Mirzakhani. We should talk about Dr. Katherine Johnson, who you might recognize from NASA, who hand calculated the orbits of spacecraft. We need to talk about people like Dr. Mae Jemison, who was the first African-American woman in space. We need to talk about Dr. Danielle Twum, an immunology researcher from California, who is real popular on TikTok with her research and in her professional work. And she doesn't appear like the typical science people that you would see if you Googled that. We need to talk about Dr. Richard Tapia, a Hispanic mathematician at Rice University in Houston. We need to talk about people like Danny Luke, a member of the Choctaw Nation who lives in North Dakota and is finishing his math doctorate. We need to talk about people like Kalpana Chawla, who was the first woman of Indian origin to fly into space, and sadly, she perished over the East Texas skies when the Space Shuttle Columbia burned up on re-entry. These are people that we need to introduce to our students so they can see themselves in people who look like them doing the science and doing the mathematics. And there's a lot of websites out there. That's where I pulled some of these from. There's Black and Gifted in Mathematics. There's Indigenous Mathematicians. You can learn a lot about people's stories by Googling that. Someone mentioned in the chat box a book, and this is something I've got dog-eared on my shelf, Women Who Count, Honoring African-American Women Mathematicians by Dr. Shelley Jones. Dr. Jones is the current president of the Benjamin Banneker Association, and she's also a professor of mathematics at Central Connecticut State University. She's done a tremendous amount of research into the contributions of Black women in mathematics. We've got some great resources being put in the chat box. This is what I love about stuff like that. We can come together and share some of our ideas and resources. And I don't want to diminish the contributions of European men and men of European descent in science and mathematics. I think where we are now is because of everybody's work, and where we're going is because of everything that we're doing now. The third pillar in the culturally relevant pedagogy framework is critical consciousness. And I like to think of this as the reason that we learn science and mathematics. Academic excellence is learning the science and mathematics content deeply and rigorously and meaningfully. Cultural competence is looking at the cultural lenses that are in the room, building more awareness of our own culture and other cultures. Critical consciousness is using the math and the science to make the world a better place. Your problem solving. I've also seen this called the socio-political consciousness. This includes the social justice component of teaching and learning. And it answers the question, what are we learning the math and the science for? So this is where you help your students and you empower your students to identify some problems in, and I hate this phrase, the real world, because what's real in the world is different depending on people's experiences. And real world is sometimes the big picture, like the global picture. Sometimes it's the school community or my neighborhood. That's the real world. So if I identify a problem that's within my community, then I can use science and mathematics to help address that. So for example, we had the Flint water crisis a few years ago, which is still ongoing, but it's not making the news anymore. That prompted a lot of people to start asking questions about their own water supply. And there's a lot of publicly available data about water testing for municipal water supplies, well water if you're in a rural area. So there's a lot of ways that you can dig into, take this national attention grabbing problem like the Flint water crisis, where an entire town's water supply was contaminated with lead poisoning through lead pipes, and use that to ask questions in your own neighborhood, in your own backyard. That's critical consciousness. And I mentioned that I live in Dallas, and when COVID hit, Dallas has, the Trinity River runs roughly northwest to southeast in the city of Dallas. And north of the river is a very different demographic than south of the river. So historically, Dallas used the Trinity River to segregate the city. Much of the wealth and the means is concentrated north of the Trinity River in Dallas. COVID laid that bare because when we were first coming out of the COVID, and I'm thinking March 13th, 2020 for me is the day that Dallas County shut down. So that's, to me, that marks the big official beginning of the pandemic. That's one of those where were you when moments for me. So as we were starting to get our heads out of the burrow from the initial sequestration for COVID, we're looking for where can we get tested. So one of the news stations put together a map of where can you get tested. Well, lo and behold, there are a whole bunch of dots on that map north of the Trinity River, not so many south. So then with vaccinations came up later that next spring, again, where do we get vaccinated? Similar map patterns in the map. So after that, that news station started kicking around, okay, so we're seeing this with healthcare resources. Why is this? Why are all the dots north of the Trinity River and not very many south of the Trinity River? And so then they started looking at things like access to healthcare in general. Where are the hospitals, the clinics, the doctor's offices? Same pattern. Where are the banking institutions? Where can I go and get financial services? Again, lots of dots north of the river, very few south of the river. Food deserts. Where can I get access to fresh food? So what these reporters, these journalists found is repeating patterns where the resources are concentrated in one part of the city, but not the other part of the city. They're using data displays to frame a social justice problem. Why do people who live in South Dallas have access to fewer resources? And now that we know that, what can we do about it? So that's the critical consciousness piece. You're using the mathematics and the science to frame a problem and then begin tackling a solution. COVID laid a lot of social problems bare so that you couldn't ignore them. It's not that they weren't there all of a sudden in 2019, oh my gosh, we've got problems, or 2020, it laid it bare. We couldn't sweep it under the rug anymore. So I'm going to introduce you to another framework for how culture and teaching and learning play. But I just put a link in the chat box, and this is to a National Science Teachers Association article. This article is gold, and I don't believe you have to be an NSTA member to access it. I think it's publicly accessible because I'm not a member and I found it. And this article beautifully lays Gloria Ladson-Billings' culturally relevant pedagogy alongside Dr. Geneva Gay's culturally responsive pedagogy framework. This QR code takes you to the same link. It's the one I put in the chat box. I use the QR code if I'm in the room with people because I like putting links in the chat box. That's something that's a habit I picked up with virtual presentations during the pandemic. And then I did a face-to-face presentation. I'm like, I need a chat box. I need a link. Then it occurred to me, Paul, use a QR code so people can actually access that information in two ways. And this article is just beautiful. I couldn't say it better myself. So I thought, you know what? Let's just give them the article so that they can read it and get some insights there. So I want to introduce you to Dr. Geneva Gay. She's a professor and researcher at the University of Washington at Seattle, and she created the culturally responsive pedagogy framework in her book of the same title in the year 2000. And this is where you're using the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frames of reference, and other things to make learning encounters more relevant and effective for diverse learners. You're harnessing the strengths of their culture instead of viewing it as a weakness or something they don't have. She describes culturally responsive pedagogy as both routine and radical. And I love that how she paired those two words together. So I want to take a second and break that down. Our school systems were set up in the 19th century factory model where we had kids come in, sit in rows, and the direct instruction is the predominant model. We know from research that for math and science in particular, a more inquiry-based approach is more effective for more students. But the school landscape that we have now still centers the experiences of the white middle-class students that the school system was designed for. And many of the math pathways that we have set up take you directly to calculus. They're intended as calculus pathways. We are creating new ones. But a lot of the structures that we have make routine the experiences of students of European descent, particularly from middle-class economics. Culturally responsive pedagogy makes routine for all students what our structures have made routine for some students. And that's part of what makes it radical, because it makes implicit the role of culture in teaching and learning. And we typically have tried to say math is math, science is science, it's independent of culture. And that's what I like to call one of those pretty little lies we tell ourselves, because come to find out that's really not the case. And Zaretta Hammond explains why. This is one of those books, when I read this, it completely changed how I thought about teaching and learning for the better. This is what Hammond is a literacy specialist from the San Francisco Bay Area. That's her background. Right now, she's a consultant and researcher. In her book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, she masterfully pulls together how the neuroscience for how the brain works with the role of culture. So if you think about the brain as almost like a computer, where our five senses collect information and it's up to our brain to make sense of it, culture is the software that our brain uses to make sense of those experiences. Because the way our brains evolved is we want to make sure that our physical safety is met. We don't want to be eaten by a lion on the savannah. So when we get new information, our brain has to process it immediately. And one of the first things that the brain does is ask, is this information a threat? And if it is a threat, like there's a mugger coming at you from down the street, then no learning happens. The brain shuts down and goes into survival mode. But if it's not a threat, then the brain welcomes that information in. And then how the brain makes sense of it is based on the culture that we have learned along the way. So the culture that we're brought up in and that we live in is what helps us interpret what's going on in the world around us. So when you have a teacher, and I'll generously say 30 students in the room, you may have 31 different cultural experiences at play, even if sometimes the nuances are slightly different. And that's why the cultural competence piece from Gloria Ladson-Billings' culturally relevant teaching framework is so important. Because if you know about the other cultures in the room and you have a deeper understanding of your own culture, which influences how you make sense of things, then you can really move into making the teaching and learning relevant to everybody, and that makes it a lot more powerful. I'll tell some stories on myself. When I was a beginning teacher, I taught at a majority Black high school. It was the high school I graduated from, and the demographics of the neighborhood shifted in the short time that I was away at college and then teaching in Oklahoma before I moved back home. So I found myself the white teacher in a room full of students of African descent. And I was brought up that when someone's talking to you, you look them in the eye. My students were taught that it was disrespectful to look an adult in the eye. So I'm trying to talk to some of my students, address some classroom management issues, some discipline questions, and they wouldn't look at me. It drove me nuts. It's like, look at me when I'm talking to you. And finally, I had a student tell me, but Mama says that's disrespectful. And then I started thinking about it and asked some people I trusted, and my student was telling me the truth. So that was where I first learned about cultural differences, even though you live in the same neighborhood. So things like that influence the human interactions in our teaching and learning. I love the windows and mirrors metaphor, and if you're coming to NCTM or NCSM, I can't believe it's next month, and starting tomorrow is going to be later this month because tomorrow is October. You're going to see a heavy theme of mirrors and windows at both conferences. And this metaphor comes from Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. And she was a language arts professor. We learn a lot from our language arts colleagues. And she created the mirrors and windows metaphor to describe how students interact with literature. Sometimes when they're reading a story, it's a mirror into their own culture and their own experiences. They see themselves in the story. But sometimes it's a window into somebody else's world. If I'm reading a story about from a Mexican American background, that's not a background that I share, but that's an opportunity for me to see a window into somebody else's culture. Rochelle Gutierrez brought that idea into mathematics because if it works well for literature, think about the contextual mathematics problems that we have, where we're not just talking about naked numbers, we're talking about math in the context of solving a problem. And every mathematics contextual problem has culture in it. The question isn't, is there culture? The question is, whose culture is it? If it's a problem about a middle school choir raising funds by selling chocolate bars, that's culture. If it's a problem about a girl planning her quinceañera, then that's culture. So how we couch the problem, the context we choose, selects someone's culture to showcase. And so when we're thinking about mathematics tasks, and I would extend this to science tasks, what culture is present in the context that we've couched it in? So sometimes that culture is going to be a mirror. Students will see themselves in there. If I'm solving a problem that it can be just a linear function problem in Algebra 1 or middle school math, where we've got a starting point and then some kind of rate of change, If I'm using the context of a quinceañera, my Hispanic girls are going to know exactly what I'm talking about. And so that's a mirror for them, but it's a window for other people in the room. So the idea of mirrors and windows is really powerful when you're looking at the kind of science or mathematics tasks you want to bring into your classroom. So why is this important? So and COVID put a big wrench in a lot of data collection. So one of the most recent pieces of data I could find was from the 17-18 school year. Our teaching faculty in that school year was 79% white, and the student body was 48% white. So what that tells me is if we use the amount of melanin in someone's skin as a metric of diversity, we have a majority white teaching faculty teaching a majority black and brown student body. And that introduces the potential for some multicultural interactions. We also know that we have multicultural classrooms, and those are ripe opportunities for windows and mirrors. And Dr. Sims Bishop also includes sliding glass doors in her metaphor, where you can actually open that glass and then step into that world temporarily before you go back in. And we can also harness Martha Seville's notion of cultural funds of knowledge. If we look at students in terms of assets, the strengths they bring to the classroom, instead of looking at them in deficit terms of what they don't have, then we can tap into their cultural funds of knowledge that they bring from home into the classroom. We're now seeing that cultural knowledge is a strength we can use to build on and layer in some mathematics and some science, instead of looking at it and going, oh, those kids don't know. Martha Seville gave us that idea of the cultural funds of knowledge. She's a professor at the University of Arizona. So now I want to move to the next milestone of how do we make our tasks more culturally relevant? So here's the problem. And I mentioned that Gloria Ladson Billings published her Dreamkeepers book in 1994. When I was a baby teacher in the Houston area, we did a faculty-wide book study on Dreamkeepers. This is in the late 90s. And I loved the book. I thought it was very powerful. And I'm looking at this and thinking, I have no idea how to do this. So it ended up in the spot on my shelf that's great ideas that I don't know what to do with yet. Culturally relevant curriculums do not exist on the shelf. That's part of the problem. That's what makes this work so hard. You have to know, as the teacher, you have to know the kids in your room. You have to ask them questions. You have to get to know the kids so that you can figure out whose cultures and which cultures are actually present in your room instead of making assumptions. And what's culturally relevant to my kids may not be culturally relevant to your kids. And this is what really got me, because I taught high school, so we were on an accelerated block schedule. So I had 3 90-minute classes, and then the fourth period was my planning period. My second period had different kids than my first period. So that made it, even within my teaching load, the kids that I had in the room, the culture varied from one class to the next. And for a beginning teacher, a novice teacher, that makes it hard. It's overwhelming. So you've got to know who's in your room so that you can make the tasks, the mathematics or the science that you're working on, more meaningful to them. So here's 4 stages that we can use to beef up and make more relevant some of our tasks. I've got the chat box going next to my presenter notes on the screen, so I'm seeing a lot of the comments in here. And it may be worth saying culturally relevant curricula does not exist on the shelf. Publishers may tell you that they have culturally relevant curriculum for you. They don't. The cultural relevance depends on who's in the room, and the teacher is the only person, the only adult that knows who's in the room. As math leaders, if we're a math coach or a science coach, We can guide our colleagues through the processes of learning more about who's in their room, and we can guide them through structures like this to help them make their tasks more relevant to the students in the room. But it's up to the teacher in the end to make it happen. So the first stage is starting with a good standards-based science or math task. And then this next stage, and this is something that I did, and it's fairly straightforward to do, you swap the names out. Take the name, if there's a student name in the problem, take that out and put one of your kids in there. If it's a school, put your school in there. Then stage 3 is where you replace the context. You preserve the mathematics, but you make the context a little bit more interesting. You kind of finesse that a little. And then stage 4 is empowering your students to be the agent of change. So stage 1 task, that's your good standards aligned stuff. And so there's several places where you can obtain math or science tasks online. You may have these already in your curriculum resources. I hope you do. Stage 2 is where you're taking okay, that's what this link was. Sorry, I'm going to back up for a second because it just dawned on me. This link that I need to give you now will take you to a document that has this information in it. And you'll have access to the recording. I saw something about we'll get you the PowerPoint so that you got this information. But I do want you to have some links to some of the documents. Stage 2 task looks like this. So on the left-hand side is the robotics club, and this is an elementary problem where you're working with decimals in 4 operations. So the robotics club at your school is hosting a fundraiser, plans to sell a slice of pizza with a cup of water for $1.10. A slice of pizza costs $1 more than the cup of water. How much should each item cost separately? So as stage 2 task, you can dress that up a little bit. So instead of saying the robotics club at your school, just put the school's name in there, like West Point Middle School. And then instead of just saying if this happens, then pop the student's name in there. And I did this at first just to get kids to pay attention because when they see their name on the board, they sit up a little straighter. But in this case, if we put Saritha in there, Saritha owns this problem now. This is her problem. And so people are going to start solving Saritha's problem. We're doing the same mathematics, but now they're invested in it because they see them. In this case, Saritha literally sees herself in the problem. And as you go through the year, you just pull different students' names in there. Same mathematics, same context, but I've personalized it a little bit. It's not some nebulous, oh yeah, this is something out there. Now it's in my world. So you can do this with names of teachers, faculty, and staff that are familiar with the students, the school mascot, local sports teams, clubs, or organizations, landmarks that are in your neighborhood. When I taught parallel lines in geometry, I was trying to get my kids to understand what alternate interior angles were. And nobody cared about the word alternate interior angles. But as soon as I went down the street and drew a picture of 2 parallel streets, we had West Little York and South Victory. I don't know why it was West and South, but they were parallel. And drew the cross street, that the kids knew the buildings and the shopping center and the houses that were in that area. So now we had that anchor. We had that culturally relevant anchor from the local neighborhood into what corresponding angles were, what alternate interior angles were. And with that connected it to their cultural funds of knowledge. I didn't know it yet, but I was bringing those into the room when I did that. I just wanted them to learn the angle relationships, but I needed that anchor to do it. Stage 3 is where we kind of bring in a task. We shift the context a little bit. So think about current events, think about pop culture, think about if there's a particular historical, if you're teaching in September, October, it's Hispanic Heritage Month. If you're teaching in February, it's Black History Month. May is Women's History Month. If we have Jewish holidays in the fall, we have different holidays at different times of the year. So think about what's going on with the kids that are in your room and what context might be important to them. So for example, this context I'm going to show you for stage 3 comes from the Montgomery bus boycott, which we learned in our history class, or some of us remember, that Rosa Parks had enough and she refused to give up her seat on the bus. She got in legal trouble, and one of the results was the Montgomery bus boycott, which happened in the 50s to further the civil rights movement. Most of us don't know about Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin was a 15-year-old teenager who did that same thing before Rosa Parks did in 1955. So we had Claudette Colvin, we had Rosa Parks. Culmination of events led to the Montgomery bus boycott. But here's the thing. When they boycotted the buses, everybody still had to get to work. So taxi cab drivers got together and decided we're going to get people to work. And so we can use something like that to shift the context. Like the birdhouse problem. I love the birdhouse problem. I think it's a cool problem. It's multi-step, it's whole numbers, it's lots of different operations. You got to get kids to think about it. So we can keep the same mathematics. We can keep the same 4 classes made. There were this many birdhouses. Now we've got 4 classes that made more. Each class made this number. How many total? Keep that same mathematics, but shift the context a little bit. So during the bus boycott, the taxi driver charged 8 cents per passenger. Then the first hour the driver worked, he made 56 cents. Second hour, the taxi driver transported 4 people. Same mathematics, new context. And it's the context that makes the difference in the relevance. Stage 4 is the agents of change piece. And so this is where we're pushing into the social justice tasks. I talked earlier about the critical consciousness piece of Gloria Ladson Billings framework. This is that. So this is where, and this is less clear for me to give you examples on how to do that, but you got to know what's going on in your community. So this is where you want to look for issues, questions people are talking about in the school area. If there's an attendance zone change going on in your school district, that's going to generate high drama. That's going to be an agent of change opportunity. But even something like pollinating plants for local bees and butterflies. I mentioned that I taught in Oklahoma and Texas, monarch migration season. Oh my gosh, how many monarchs are out there? What food sources are and shelter is available for them. Great opportunities to get people involved. Looking at access of resources within the community, grocery store, healthcare deserts, resource allocation in the school. What do they sell in the cafeteria? What do they sell in the bookstore? Is it really what we need? Is it who is the target market here? You can ask a lot of questions about what's going on in the school. There's also good sources, and I'm kind of looking at the clock here. We're pushing up at the top of the hour, so I'm going to do something I don't normally do and talk fast. There's good resources out there. I mentioned Shelley Jones earlier with the Women in Mathematics Education. She and her colleagues also have a new series of books out engaging in culturally relevant math tasks. Their NCTM has a lot of resources available for digging into social justice and rethinking how we teach mathematics. NSTA has parallel resources available for science. To create tasks with our kids or with our teachers, it's important to do this in a professional learning community environment. And y'all, this is one of my very favorite tools. This is the cognitively demanding, culturally relevant rubric. Culturally relevant, cognitive demanding rubric. And it's got 3 simple stages. So what I like to do is gather teachers around the table and ask them, bring a task, bring a good task that you love doing, and we're going to use this rubric to kind of tweak it a little bit. So we can think about those 4 stages I just showed you, but a rubric like this makes it really helpful to guide teachers through processes to make their good tasks even better and more relevant. So stage 1 here is the emerging level. You've got to have the cognitive lift. If the task doesn't have the cognitive lift required for the curriculum standard you're teaching, put it aside and find another one. You got to have the cognitive rigor. The second level is developing, and this is where you're pulling in some of the cultural self-community inquiry pieces. You're putting the context to make it relevant to what's going on in the students' cultures or the community. And the third level, the exemplary, that pulls in the empowerment and social justice piece. Are we using this task to make our world a better place? Not all of your tasks have to be at the exemplary level. If I'm working with kids and I'm doing a lot of developing tasks where I've got the cognitive rigor, but I'm pulling in the cultural and community awareness pieces, that's great. You've got to have some tasks that are there. Not every task is going to be a change the world task, but you do need to have a couple of those in there as you go through the school year. And there's a couple of examples that are in here, but I'm going to kind of skip through because I want to share this other resource with you. And this is a force copy link. So if you click on that, this will take you to a form that I gave you in PDF a little bit ago, but this will open it in a Google Doc format. And once you do that, you can edit it and you can download it as a Word document. So when you're working with your colleagues in a professional learning community situation, and you want to take some of your tasks and go through a process to make them more relevant to your students, walk through the stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 process, this is a tool you can use to do that. Stage 2 is the replace the names that are meaningful to your students. Stage 3 is the replace the context, shift the context a little bit. And stage 4 is the agents of change piece. Peer feedback is really critical. It's good to do this on your own, but it's really powerful when you can sit down with a couple of colleagues and kind of peer review each other, kind of like we did back in high school. Swap your essay and provide one another feedback. And to cap things up here as we're bumping into the top of the hour, we know that the instructional tasks a teacher selects are absolutely critical for the science and the mathematics that students are going to learn and the experiences that they will have. The teacher makes the biggest difference in what's taught and learned in the room, and the tasks the teacher uses influences what's going on. Professional learning and professional time to do this is critical. So all that said, the bell's about to ring, and I can tell because everybody's gathering their books and their stuff, and you can tell I taught high school. I don't mind that. Don't be a stranger. Follow NCSM. Follow me on Twitter. That's my email address. And I want to thank everyone for spending an hour at the beginning of your day in this conference. It's going to be a great day of learning. I can't wait. And Vince, I want to thank you and your colleagues at Texas Instruments for gathering us together today and for inviting me to kick off a day of learning.
Paul, again, just grateful and thankful. Again, you gave us so many things to think about. And the other part is, again, you put some significant challenges in front of us, and I'm grateful for that. And again, just as a reminder, again, this is a great group of individuals that are going to be with us all day long. So use the chat, use the individuals that are with us throughout the day. So Paul, thank you very much. And we will see you for sure in, about a month or so, a little less than a month. Again, just so that everybody knows, you'll get an email with a survey, but also you'll get an email with a link of the materials that we have in each of the sessions. And again, if you need some help, a variety of different ways at Texas Instruments for us to help you. These are educational technology consultants. They can help you with a math tool, so you can, again, I learned from Paul, let's use the QR code. These are technologies that are out there, and but you can call and or email each of these or any of these educational technology consultants. So we randomly selected a winner for a TI graphing calculator, and our winner for this first keynote session is Tucker Green. And so Tucker will be in touch with you and provide for you a graphing calculator. And as Paul mentioned, again, it's straight up 10 o'clock, and your next session starts at 10:15. So loiter around in the halls a little bit, get some water, get some coffee, and we will get started back in your individual